In the brutal winter of 1847, something came to the remote mountain town of Millbrook, Vermont, something that would haunt its people for generations. He called himself Samuel Hawthorne. Though no official record of that name exists, prior to the February night, he stepped out of a blizzard that had already claimed 17 lives across Windham County. He spoke of distant valleys beyond the peaks and possessed medical knowledge that saved many during a deadly outbreak, earning the town's gratitude. But what they would come to learn about him would unravel their faith in humanity and reveal a darkness survival alone cannot justify. For over 170 years, the Millbrook Historical Society has kept certain documents under lock and key documents that reveal who Hawthorne really was, what he did to survive in the wilderness, and what he continued to do long after being rescued. His story isn't just about survival. It's about how easily a man can become something monstrous when stripped of civilization. How a savior's mask can hide a predator's intentions, and how entire communities can fall under the influence of a philosophy built on cruelty, masked as wisdom. Before diving deeper into Samuel Hawthorne's chilling legacy, don't forget to subscribe and comment your state, because what happened in Millbrook wasn't isolated. Similar disappearances followed his path through New England, affecting over 60 families in 4 states, and the authorities only recognized the pattern far too late. The records you're about to hear were never digitized or publicly released, and for good reason. They confront truths about human nature few are willing to face. Millbrook in 1847 was a tightly knit valley town northeast of Bennington with fewer than 300 residents, farmers, loggers, and families clinging to survival in one of the harshest corners of Vermont. Founded in 1789 by Revolutionary War veterans, the town had become largely forgotten by the 1840s. Its only connection to the outside world, blocked by impassable mountain roads each winter. That particular winter was vicious. Temperatures dropped so low that the local physician, Dr. Ezekiel Putnam, a Harvard-trained doctor who had fled Boston after gambling, ruined his career, wrote in his journal that even whiskey froze solid overnight. The Connecticut River froze 4 feet deep, cutting off vital supplies. Not even Henrik Bergstrom, a seasoned Norwegian logger who had survived Arctic winters, could endure the cold. He was found frozen in his collapsed cabin after a blizzard. Families suffered from hunger and illness while supplies dwindled. The last wagons had come through in November, and no help was expected until the thaw. Dr. Putnam was running out of medicine down to his final bottles of laudanum and quinine, and his instruments were wearing out. Whispers of a cursed winter began spreading, and some elders considered abandoning Millbrook entirely. Into this grim landscape walked Samuel Hawthorne, emerging from a storm like a phantom. His arrival on February 18th is etched into Millbrook's memory, chronicled in journals and diaries. Jeremiah Prescott's teenage son Timothy first spotted him, a lone figure striding through the storm with uncanny purpose. Most people lost in such conditions stagger aimlessly until death. But this man walked with precision, as though following a map only he could see. The townsfolk gathered to watch him descend from the mountain, his body upright against gale-force winds, his pace calm and deliberate. His clothes baffled everyone, made from strange armor-like material that repelled snow. His boots left unfamiliar tracks marked by geometric patterns and metal studs. Dr. Putnam sketched them later, noting they resembled nothing manufactured in Europe or America. Hawthorne's physical state was even more disturbing. Despite allegedly spending days in lethal cold, he had no frostbite. He moved with strength and clarity, showing none of the exhaustion or damage expected. Tall and lean, he bore scars and calluses of a laborer. But his pale blue eyes, almost colorless, made people uneasy. He seemed to study people with unsettling intensity, memorizing everything: who lived where, how families operated, who held power. He spoke flawless English with an accent no one could place, a blend of several origins, yet belonging to none. Dr. Putnam described it as eerily eclectic. Hawthorne claimed to come from beyond the mountains, from ancient valleys, where the seasons followed older patterns and survival demanded acceptance of nature's cruelties. Children were drawn to his tales of distant lands. Adults, however, found him unnerving, but couldn't explain why. Most disturbing was the satchel he carried, a weatherproof bag containing his medicines and survival tools. Though no one knew what was inside at first, that satchel would soon become a source of nightmares. But desperate for hope, the people welcomed him. That first night, while warming himself at the Millbrook Inn, he treated Sarah Thornberry, a 12-year-old, with a worsening cough. Dr. Putnam suspected tuberculosis, but Hawthorne diagnosed smoke-induced infection and produced a dark liquid that smelled of pine and something unidentifiable. After a few drops, Sarah's coughing eased, and by morning she could breathe freely. Word spread fast. By the next day, villagers lined up at the inn seeking help. Within days, Hawthorne had become Millbrook's second doctor. Though Putnam remained skeptical, even he couldn't deny the effectiveness of Hawthorne's remedies. Still, unease lingered. The deeper Hawthorne embedded himself in Millbrook, the more he seemed to change the town, not just its health, but its way of thinking. Something beneath the surface had begun to shift, and the contents of that mysterious satchel were just the beginning. Hawthorne had an uncanny ability to diagnose illnesses instantly, often identifying conditions that had puzzled Dr. Putnam for weeks. He could locate herbs even in the dead of winter, digging beneath feet of snow to unearth medicinal plants as though he knew exactly where they grew. His treatments worked with startling speed and effectiveness, teetering on the edge of the miraculous. When young Sarah Thornberry began showing symptoms of what Putnam feared was consumption, the same illness that had already claimed 3 lives the previous year, Hawthorne concocted a remedy that involved boiling roots with what he called preserved mountain game prepared according to the old traditions of his people. The process took hours and filled the Thornberry home with an odor that was sweet and cloying, yet disturbingly reminiscent of the time Henrik Bergstrom's body had gone undiscovered for nearly a week in his collapsed cabin. Mrs. Foresk, a local expert in food preservation, couldn't identify a single scent in the mixture, and grew uneasy when Hawthorne explained his people had developed such methods over generations. The medicine worked. Sarah recovered in 3 days, though she was haunted by nightmares, visions of endless snowfields, shadowy figures whispering in unknown tongues, and invitations to join a feast that promised warmth and eternal companionship. Her mother Grace, overwhelmed with gratitude, insisted Hawthorne stay in their spare room despite her husband's unease. Grace soon began documenting the stranger's odd behavior in unsent letters to her sisters, letters that would later serve as vital evidence. Hawthorne never slept more than a few hours at a time and always seemed to be listening for something. He would sit motionless by the window for hours, eyes fixed on the snow as though expecting it to reveal secrets. He ventured out in the worst storms, returning dry and unscathed with fresh meat he claimed to have hunted despite no recent sightings of game and lethal temperatures that kept even seasoned trappers indoors. The cuts he brought back looked precise, but wrong. Hunters whispered that the bones didn't match any local species, and the color and texture of the meat defied explanation. Putnam, whose medical training included anatomy, examined some of it and became alarmed. The muscle fibers looked disturbingly human. When he confronted Hawthorne, the man offered no denial. Instead, he smiled and explained that his people didn't share civilized squeamishness. Meat, he said, was meat. What mattered was preparation and spiritual intent. One morning, Grace caught Hawthorne polishing a silver locket while humming a tune she found deeply unsettling, a melody that echoed the dirges of her childhood. When she asked about it, He replied it had belonged to a dear friend from home who couldn't make the journey. But Grace was certain she had seen that exact locket on Rebecca Henley, the merchant's wife who vanished with her husband during an autumn journey to Albany. No trace had ever been found, and now the locket, distinctive and Irish-made, was in the hands of the man who had emerged from the mountains months later. At night, strange noises drifted from Hawthorne's room, scraping, faint weeping and rhythmic tapping that couldn't be explained by wind or settling timbers. When Thomas Thornbury asked Hawthorne, said he was drawing maps and recording his learnings. He showed Thomas sheets of treated hide inscribed with complex symbols and topographical sketches. The maps were detailed, showing caves, routes, and shelters invisible to the average eye. Some locations bore strange symbols, tallies, marks, and notes in an unknown language, indicating he was tracking something or someone. Putnam, increasingly suspicious, began his own observations. He noticed that patients treated by Hawthorne recovered quickly, but something changed in them. They developed unusual cravings for meat and displayed protective, aggressive behavior over food. More alarmingly, they shared similar nightmares. Visions of wandering snowy wilderness, being called to feasts by unseen beings, promising warmth and belonging. These recurring dreams, shared across patients, suggested to Putnam a psychological manipulation, possibly induced by Hawthorne's medicines. Then came the final blow. Analyzing a sample of Hawthorne's powdered remedy under his microscope, Putnam identified human hair and bone fragments. When he presented his findings, Hawthorne responded not with denial, but admiration. He seemed genuinely pleased, praising Putnam's intelligence and confirming the discovery. Yes, he said, the best medicine is derived from the human body itself. Properly prepared, it could heal and strengthen in ways no plant or mineral could. It created bonds deeper than any sacrament, a communion that transcended civilization. The implication was horrifying. Hawthorne wasn't just administering human remains as medicine. He was conditioning the townspeople, body and mind, to accept cannibalism not only as necessary, but as sacred. The dreams, the behavior, the cravings. It was all part of a calculated effort to erode their moral resistance. As winter deepened into March, Millbrook's recovery under Hawthorne's care became increasingly sinister. While ailments vanished and vitality returned, something else was taking root, something primal and irreversible. Dr. Putnam, once intrigued by his mysterious colleague, now documented him with the focus of a man trying to preserve his town from an invisible contagion, one that was not of the body, but of the soul. Hawthorne's medical kit was unlike anything Dr. Putnam had encountered in his years of study and practice. The tools inside didn't resemble surgical instruments, so much as implements of butchery, scalpels with curved blades seemingly designed to peel flesh with brutal efficiency. Small saws whose teeth were arranged for cutting bone rather than executing delicate operations, and vials of powders and liquids that emitted strange, almost chemical sweet odors no known pharmaceutical could explain. When Putnam inquired about their composition, hoping to learn some foreign technique, Hawthorne responded with evasive mysticism. Tales of ancient family knowledge passed down by healers from the old country, secrets that he insisted lost their potency if shared with outsiders. But the truth behind Hawthorne's nature began to unravel not through science, but through the curiosity of a boy. Timothy Prescott, the same teen who had first seen Hawthorne emerge from the storm, stumbled upon a discovery that would shatter any lingering trust the townspeople had in their enigmatic guest. Exploring the woods behind the Thornbury property, Timothy spotted what appeared to be a partially collapsed animal den or old mine shaft hidden by snow and fallen branches. As he cleared the debris, he realized the depression led into a hollowed chamber beneath the hillside, its entrance cleverly disguised, but clearly in use. Inside, the space had been carefully modified into a storage vault, its walls lined with hides of some strange, treated material, unlike anything local trappers produced. What Timothy found inside shook him to his core. Folded and organized in bundles were articles of clothing. Men's shirts, women's dresses, children's coats, all preserved, all stained, many sliced or torn, as if forcibly removed from their owners. These garments, some outdated and others modern, represented years of collection from various places and periods. There were also personal effects, wedding bands, pocket watches, jewelry, children's toys, family photographs, religious tokens, all too cherished to have been discarded. But the most chilling were the anatomical drawings meticulously sketched and preserved in oiled cloth, showing human bodies broken down into parts not for healing, but for harvesting. With notations indicating ideal cut points for maximum yield instructions, for preserving flesh in freezing conditions, and techniques for preparing various portions for consumption, the illustrations read like a manual for field dressing livestock, except the subjects were unmistakably human. Some drawings contrasted with similar techniques for processing animals, like deer or elk, suggesting the same methods could be applied across species. The clinical precision made it clear the artist had not merely imagined these practices, but had carried them out. Timothy ran home in terror, and though his father initially dismissed the tale as a boy's winter-fevered imagination, Jeremiah Prescott eventually followed his son to the cache. There, faced with undeniable evidence, his doubts dissolved into horror. Among the grisliest finds was a journal written in the same deliberate hand as Hawthorne's maps. The entries stretched back 3 years and described so-called expeditions into the mountains, chilling records of encounters with isolated travelers, lone families, and vulnerable groups. The journal didn't recount accidental meetings. It detailed deliberate targeting, trapping, and processing of people under the guise of offering help during storms or on dangerous passes. One entry, dated 18 months before Hawthorne's arrival, chronicled how a family of 5 traveling to Albany for work had been lured into a detour and then slaughtered. The description read like a medical case report: who died first, how the bodies were handled, which parts were preserved, and how their meat was distributed across time. But it wasn't random violence or opportunistic killing. This was a systematic, ritualistic method of turning humans into resources, flesh for food material for medicine. The author described human meat as the most nutritionally complete protein source, listing techniques for curing and preserving it during long winters, and outlining how the remains could be used for medicinal concoctions. Far more disturbing were entries focused on the psychological effects of human flesh consumption. The journal detailed methods of introducing cannibalism without detection, beginning with trace amounts mixed into stews and medicines, increasing slowly until the subject no longer noticed the difference. It described behavioral changes, heightened aggression, intense cravings for meat, susceptibility to suggestion, and emotional detachment. The author proudly noted how this process eroded the mental resistance of those who had once found the practice abhorrent, eventually converting them into willing participants. This conditioning wasn't just meant to nourish, it was meant to recruit. The journal admitted that similar techniques had been used in other communities, building small circles of accomplices under the guise of healing. As Jeremiah reached the final pages, it became devastatingly clear Hawthorne was enacting the same process in Millbrook. He wasn't just treating the townspeople, he was feeding them human flesh, reconditioning them psychologically and preparing them to become part of his network. Under his care, they weren't healing. They were being transformed. One dose, one meal, one nightmare at a time, Samuel Hawthorne was converting Millbrook into a sanctuary for the unthinkable, and no one had seen it coming. Faced with the horrifying truth, Jeremiah Prescott grappled with a decision no one should have to make. Samuel Hawthorne. The man who had healed the sick, saved the weak, and carried Millbrook through the most brutal winter in living memory, was not a savior, but something far darker. Yet, how do you accuse a man of murder and cannibalism when he's seen as a miracle worker, a gift from Providence? People were still recovering under his care, still alive because of his treatments. The community trusted him, admired him, even with a journal and grotesque sketches in hand. Prescott knew the townspeople might dismiss it all as lies or hysteria, especially if Hawthorne, with his charm and silver tongue, spun an alternative story. So Prescott turned to Dr. Putnam, the only man in Millbrook who might fully grasp the implications of what they were dealing with and help expose Hawthorne without inciting panic or giving him the chance to vanish. The doctor's reaction was immediate shock, followed by grim validation. He had harbored suspicions for weeks, and Prescott's discovery confirmed every nightmare he hadn't dared voice. Together they launched a careful, methodical investigation. Putnam began pressing Hawthorne for specifics about his training, seeking names, institutions or locations that might lend credibility to his methods. But Hawthorne's answers were vague, always cloaked in tales of distant master healers, ancient rites, and sacred traditions too dangerous to share with the uninitiated. When Putnam suggested documenting Hawthorne's techniques for medical journals, spreading his miracle cures to suffering communities across New England, the stranger became visibly unsettled. He warned that exposing his methods to outsiders would destroy their power and bring harm, not healing. Meanwhile, Prescott turned his attention to broader patterns. Drawing on his network of merchants and mountain traders, he began compiling reports of disappearances over the past 4 years. What he uncovered was terrifying. Families traveling through the mountain passes had vanished at an alarming rate. Hunters had failed to return. Campsites were found abandoned, wagons left half-packed as though people had been snatched by the storm itself. All of it occurred during winter, when weather hampered searches and snow buried the dead. But what truly chilled Prescott was how far back the pattern stretched. He traced it 7 years across Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts. In each case, a mysterious stranger had arrived during a crisis, offered miraculous aid, then vanished, often coinciding with a spike in missing persons. In Grafton, Vermont, during an 1844 diphtheria outbreak, a healer named Samuel Thorne appeared, cured dozens, then disappeared along with several families who were said to be moving west. In North Conway, New Hampshire, in the brutal winter of 1845, a man calling himself Samuel Blackthorne eased a famine and vanished when investigators questioned his background. The names changed. The pattern did not. Each time arrival, trust, dependence, disappearance. Each time medicine, influence, manipulation, and silence. In Millbrook, it was happening again. Dr. Putnam, now deeply disturbed, re-examined Hawthorne's treatments with greater scrutiny. Using chemical tests from his Harvard training, he confirmed the worst: the medicines contained human tissue. Multiple samples from multiple individuals, suggesting a vast ongoing supply. Even more horrifying was the discovery that the compounds had been deliberately designed to be psychologically addictive. They altered brain chemistry, creating dependency and weakening the mind's resistance to suggestion. The miraculous recoveries weren't just about healing. They were part of a calculated system to build loyalty and erase moral boundaries. When Putnam finally confronted Hawthorne, expecting denial or outrage, the man's reaction was far more terrifying. Calm, measured, even pleased. He seemed relieved, as if someone had finally caught up to his vision. "You don't understand what true survival requires," Hawthorne said, his pale eyes gleaming with something that wasn't quite madness, but wasn't human either. "In the places I've been, in the choices I've made, the lines between medicine and necessity vanish. The body provides all that's needed if one has the knowledge and the will to use it." He spoke like a professor, explaining not just a method, but a philosophy. The human body, he insisted, held within it every cure, every sustenance, every resource required to survive the harshest conditions. The key was accepting the unacceptable, discarding the delusions of civilization, and embracing nature's most sacred lesson. Survival favors those who are willing to become what others fear. As Putnam listened, horrified and transfixed, he realized something even worse than the murders had taken root. Hawthorne didn't just kill, he converted. And now with Millbrook under his influence, that process was almost complete. Your civilized society has built artificial taboos around the most natural and efficient form of sustenance, Hawthorne told Dr. Putnam, his voice steady, his expression unreadable. My people learned long ago that such taboos are luxuries indulged only by the weak and well-fed. When winter comes, when the hunger is real and death stalks every home, squeamishness is not just foolish. It becomes lethal. That conversation shattered the last remnants of doubt in Putnam's mind. Hawthorne wasn't merely a killer. He was a methodical predator who had honed his practices through years of experimentation, using medicine as a cloak for his atrocities and gradually converting entire communities to his warped philosophy. As winter waned, Millbrook's descent accelerated. More and more residents displayed the same disturbing symptoms, an obsession with meat raw if necessary, a cold detachment from former norms, and a creeping hostility toward outsiders. Families awoke to find children gnawing on scraps of protein in the dark, speaking of dreams filled with snowy feasts and shadowy figures who whispered ancient truths. Adults began hoarding heirlooms from the dead, claiming to honor their spirits, but guarding these tokens with a possessiveness that seemed deeply primal. And when a traveler wandered into Millbrook during a March storm, the townspeople didn't welcome him. They watched in silence, hungry, their gazes predatory. Dr. Putnam wrote in his journal that they looked at the stranger not with hospitality, but with the gaze of wolves evaluating prey. The final undeniable proof of what was unfolding came when Grace Thornberry found her youngest daughter, Mary, crouched in the cellar in the dead of night, chewing feverishly on raw, salted pork. Her face and hands were smeared in blood, her eyes wild, her voice alien. "The teacher says we must learn to eat what the mountain provides," Mary whispered, licking her fingers. "He says the old people were wrong to waste food just because it walked on two legs. When we eat the right way, we're never hungry. We never fear the winter." Grace's blood ran cold. Her daughter wasn't just sick, she had been indoctrinated, conditioned, and it was spreading. That same night, Thomas Thornberry stumbled into the barn and found Hawthorne bathed in candlelight, methodically slicing meat on the livestock workbench. At first, Thomas thought it might be a pig or a deer, but the bone structure was wrong, unmistakably human. Hawthorne's strange surgical instruments glinted as he divided the corpse into neat cuts, wrapping each piece with practiced care. Around him stood jars and satchels labeled in the same eerie symbols found in his journal. When he noticed Thomas, Hawthorne simply smiled and gestured calmly, inviting him closer. "Perfect timing," he said. "Your children have made such wonderful progress. It's important that you understand how we're helping them." This, he gestured to the flesh on the table, was the traveler who passed through last week. He was already dying. Rather than waste what nature provides, I preserved what could be used for the good of the community. Mary's recovery was thanks to him. Thomas staggered back. "You fed my daughter." "A man," he whispered, horrified. Hawthorne, serene, corrected him. "I fed your daughter the most powerful sustenance known to man. In my homeland, we know that consuming human flesh is not an act of depravity, it's communion. It creates bonds deeper than blood or law. Your family is becoming part of something eternal." His eyes glowed with fervor. They'll never fear hunger again, never fear winter. They'll know the world as it truly is, a place where strength survives, where death feeds life, and where waste is the only sin. But the horror wasn't over. It was only beginning. What happened next would become legend, the event burned into the memory of Millbrook's descendants as the Night of Blood and Snow. On March 15, 1847, the town's last line of resistance made its move. Dr. Putnam and Jeremiah Prescott, armed with evidence and desperation, rallied a small band of allies, Reverend Greenfield Town Constable Marcus Hartwell, innkeeper Joshua Foresk, and Abigail's brother-in-law, who had arrived from Bennington and had already sensed something deeply wrong. They had a plan: quietly confront and arrest Hawthorne, confiscate his materials, and contact federal authorities. But Hawthorne had been watching. He knew. And what they walked into at the Thornbury farm was not a home, but a nightmare. Candlelight flickered from every window, casting shadows that moved in unnatural patterns. The house was too quiet. No laughter, no footsteps, just the low rhythmic sound of chanting like a heartbeat in song. When the men knocked, Thomas answered. But he wasn't Thomas anymore. His eyes held that same pale, empty gleam Hawthorne's followers shared. His speech was slow, rehearsed, coded in that foreign cadence. Behind him, Grace stood bloody-handed in a shredded dress, her face frozen in beatific calm, her hair unkempt, her posture rigid like a statue carved from madness. "Samuel has shown us the truth," Thomas said. "Would you like to learn?" Putnam pushed his way inside, driven by instinct and terror. What he saw defied everything he knew about human behavior. The living room had been transformed into a shrine of meat and ritual. Bones were arranged in patterns on the floor. The furniture had been pushed aside to make space for what appeared to be a feast, parts of human bodies carefully prepared, some already consumed. The children were nowhere in sight. The walls were daubed in blood, and strange symbols marked every corner. In the center of it all sat Samuel Hawthorne, cloaked in his leather-like garments, calm and composed, as if presiding over a sacred rite. He rose when the men entered, smiling, his hands outstretched as if welcoming them to a sermon. That was the night everything changed. If this story chills you to the bone, share it with someone who appreciates the dark corners of history. Hit the like button to support our work, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of America's forgotten horrors. Because what happened in Millbrook didn't end that night. It was just the beginning of the reckoning. And Samuel Hawthorne wasn't done yet. The furniture inside the Thornbury home had been rearranged into a ritualistic tableau. Their once familiar dining table now served as a grotesque altar positioned at the center of the room and surrounded by chairs set in a perfect circle. Grace, Sarah, Mary, and little William sat motionless with several neighbors' people who were supposed to have gone home hours earlier, each wearing the same hollow, predatory stare as Thomas and Grace. In the center knelt Samuel Hawthorne, calm and composed, his hands busy over the blood-soaked white cloth that covered the altars. Putnam, eyes adjusting to the dim candlelight, first mistook the form on the table for livestock. But then he saw the truth. The remains were human. Systematically butchered, each cut was separated and displayed with surgical precision. Around the altar sat labeled jars and containers, all marked with the same cryptic symbols found in Hawthorne's journals, each one holding preserved organs, severed limbs, and tissue prepared for storage or consumption. This wasn't random violence. It was ritual, methodical, and deliberate. "Ah," Dr. Hawthorne said, without turning his voice calm, clinical. "Perfect timing. We were just completing young Mary's initiation into the deeper mysteries. Theory has its limits. True understanding requires participation in the sacred feast." He stood, surgical tools glinting in the flickering candlelight, like relics from some ancient cult. The families who disappeared didn't die from cold or hunger. They became part of something greater. Their sacrifice ensured the survival of someone who could use their resources with purpose. Around the room, everyone stared at the newcomers. Putnam Prescott, Reverend Greenfield, and the others not with fear, but with hunger. Eyes tracked every movement with animal focus. These weren't townspeople anymore. They were converts, predators in human form. Whatever Hawthorne had fed them, whatever sermons he'd whispered over their doses of medicine had broken down their identities and rebuilt them from the ground up. "You've drugged them," Putnam whispered, barely audible. "You've conditioned them chemically, psychologically. You've made them believe this is necessary." Hawthorne's tone shifted, rising with evangelical fervor. "I've helped them embrace a truth your society has spent centuries denying. That survival demands strength. That waste is sin. That the human body, when properly respected, provides the most complete nourishment for human life." He gestured to the arrayed remains with pride. "In my homeland, any land touched by winter's cruelty, we've learned human fellowship requires sacrifice. The many sustain the few who lead. These people are no longer weak. They are unified, disciplined, unafraid. They are free." Reverend Greenfield, pale and trembling, found his voice. "You speak of community, but this is murder. Cannibalism. You've turned them into monsters." Hawthorne laughed, not maniacally, but softly, sincerely. "Monsters, Reverend. Look again. These people are thriving. Their children grow strong. Their families are closer than ever. I've given them more than your abstract morality ever could. I've given them clarity, purpose, the will to survive." Then the slaughter began. The converts attacked with terrifying speed and coordination. They moved like a practiced unit, not a panicked mob. Every strike precise, every movement deliberate. Thomas Thornbury lunged with impossible speed, slashing across Constable Hartwell's face with clawed, calloused hands before the man could draw his weapon. Grace produced a butcher's knife from beneath her dress and advanced on Greenfield, her expression calm, eyes locked with surgical focus. But worst of all were the children, Sarah Mary and William. They struck like shadows, darting under defenses, biting, clawing, stabbing. They had been trained, conditioned to fight with absolute ruthlessness. Their innocence had been erased. Dr. Putnam found himself struggling against people whose ailments he'd once treated, whose babies he'd delivered. Now they came at him with blood-stained hands and gleaming eyes, fighting not out of madness, but out of loyalty to their teacher. Their transformation wasn't just mental, it was philosophical. Their world had shifted, and he was the intruder. The melee tore through the house, a chaotic frenzy of knives, fists, and firelight. Those who had come to end Hawthorne's reign barely escaped. Putnam fled, battered and bloodied, his memories seared with the night's images. Joshua Foresque made it to his horse, galloping toward Bennington for help he would never reach. Greenfield Hartwell and Thomas Thornbury vanished into the blood-soaked darkness of the converted home, never to be seen again. At dawn, Millbrook rose in grim defiance. The surviving townspeople, now understanding the true depth of Hawthorne's infiltration, prepared to end the nightmare. But what they faced was no longer a single man. It was an organized community fortified by belief and ritual. The siege of the Thornbury house began that morning and lasted 3 days. What followed wasn't battle, it was war. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Former friends exchanged gunfire and blades. The house had been prepared for this, barricaded and defensible, stocked with food, medicine, weapons. Hawthorne had planned for resistance. His converts fought with brutal discipline, launching coordinated attacks, using the terrain, deploying ambushes and psychological tactics to wear down the attackers. It worked. The unconverted townspeople hesitated, struggling to fight people they'd known their whole lives. Some couldn't bring themselves to strike back. Others faltered when faced with the dead-eyed stares of once innocent children now wielding blades with joy. Hawthorne's most powerful weapon wasn't his philosophy. It was his ability to erase identity, to turn memory and community into tools of manipulation. Dr. Putnam documented the entire siege in his journals, now considered one of the most chilling first-hand accounts of mass psychological conversion in American history. He wrote of fathers forced to kill their own sons, of mothers choosing between self-preservation and mercy, of families shattered by belief systems that had metastasized into violence. He described the pain of watching morality disintegrate under the weight of desperation. He recorded every heartbreak, every moment when decency gave way to horror. And he warned repeatedly that what happened in Millbrook could happen anywhere. All it took was the right winter and the right teacher. On the third morning of the siege, it all ended. Not with victory, not with justice, but with absence. When the weary townspeople finally breached the barricades of the Thornbury house, they found it silent, abandoned. No bodies, no captives. Only traces of a hasty retreat, empty jars missing supplies, scattered tools, and footprints leading into the wilderness. Samuel Hawthorne and his most loyal followers had vanished into the mountains, taking with them weapons, preserved food, and the knowledge required to survive indefinitely off the land. They were gone, absorbed into the forest that had always seemed to hide and protect him. What remained in Millbrook was devastation. The town, once tight-knit and hopeful, would never be the same. Of the 43 residents who had fallen under Hawthorne's influence, only 12 ever returned, most broken, silent, and distant. They came back in scattered intervals over the following months, hollow-eyed and changed, refusing to speak about what had happened in the mountains. The few who stayed didn't last long. Whispers followed them. Neighbors stared with suspicion. Some left for distant cities seeking anonymity. Others vanished again, this time by choice, disappearing into the frontier, perhaps searching for places where their altered values wouldn't make them monsters. Dr. Putnam, one of the few survivors untouched by the conversion, dedicated the rest of his life to documenting what he'd witnessed. His journals, now locked away in the restricted archives of the Vermont Historical Society, remain the most comprehensive account of the Hawthorne phenomenon. They describe not only the psychological collapse of Millbrook, but the methods used to achieve it: trust, ritual medicine, and fear. Putnam's meticulous notes reveal a deliberate system of moral erosion and identity reconstruction. Hawthorne hadn't just preyed on a town, he'd rewritten its soul. When spring thawed, the mountain search parties discovered what the snow had hidden. Scattered across the wilderness were caches, makeshift depots, stocked with preserved human remains, labeled body parts, and belongings of missing families. The evidence confirmed that Hawthorne had been operating for years. These caches weren't random. They were expertly constructed, equipped with tools, medicines, and chemical compounds used in the creation of his treatments. He had built an infrastructure, refrigeration pits, distillation equipment, drying racks, and preservative systems. The sophistication stunned authorities. It was a mobile operation capable of relocating and rebuilding wherever needed. And it raised one terrifying question: how many others were doing the same? Then came the discovery that changed everything. In late April, a hunter stumbled upon a settlement far from any trail, buried deep in the mountains. What he found wasn't just a hideout. It was a laboratory, a headquarters. Inside were journals written in Hawthorne's precise hand, along with medical tools unlike any in known surgical practice. There were workshops producing his strange, armor-like clothing and designs for surgical instruments and psychological conditioning aids. These weren't the remnants of madness. They were blueprints. The journals revealed Hawthorne's true mission. Millbrook had not been an accident. It had been a test, a trial. He referred to his work as a model for post-civilizational survival. His aim was not mere survival through winter, but the creation of self-sufficient, morally detached communities capable of thriving through social collapse. His methods prioritized efficiency over empathy, unity over individuality, and survival over morality. Each test followed the same progression: infiltration during crisis, establishment of trust through healing, introduction of unconventional practices, gradual psychological reprogramming, and then, if conversion failed, elimination and relocation. He had done this before, multiple times. Grafton, North Conway, smaller hamlets long since abandoned or forgotten. He listed them with the cold precision of a field scientist tracking data. In each case, the goal was not to serve himself, but to refine the process for larger application. And most chilling of all, Hawthorne was not acting alone. The journals referenced an entity known only as the Council, overseen by the directors. These were not the ramblings of a madman. These were field reports, coordinated, supervised, funded. He had been trained, deployed, and evaluated. And Millbrook was merely one node in a growing network. The ultimate vision. A lattice of interconnected, self-sustaining survivalist enclaves spread across the Northeast, capable of enduring any calamity, natural, societal, or man-made. Each community conditioned to abandon conventional ethics in favor of what Hawthorne called functional truth. The strong would lead. The weak would feed. Waste nothing. Fear nothing. Despite the efforts of local law enforcement, federal marshals, and even military search teams, Samuel Hawthorne was never captured. No further trace of him was ever found. Some believed he died in the mountains. Others feared he was merely continuing the cycle, moving on to another vulnerable town, waiting for the next harsh winter, the next crisis. Perhaps he'd changed his name again, refined his methods, recruited new followers. Or perhaps he was never meant to be caught at all. The truth may be even more disturbing, because if Samuel Hawthorne wasn't working alone, if his methods were part of a wider program, then what happened in Millbrook wasn't the end. It was just the prototype. In 1851, just 4 years after the horrors of Millbrook, rumors began to spread through isolated settlements in northern Maine. A helpful stranger had appeared during a punishing winter, offering medical aid, survival knowledge, and calm reassurance to families teetering on the edge of starvation. By 1854, similar reports emerged from the remote backwoods of New Hampshire, a tall man with pale eyes and prematurely white-streaked hair who arrived in the midst of crisis, spoke in quiet, deliberate tones, and seemed to know exactly what people needed to hear in their darkest hour. Each case followed the same pattern. Arrival during catastrophe, earning trust through miraculous healing, introducing strange but practical survival techniques. And then either the community fell silent or the stranger vanished. Sometimes both. The last confirmed sighting came in 1859, deep in the snowbound mining camps of northern Michigan. That winter was so brutal, it had already claimed several lives before the man appeared, claiming to come from distant lands, beyond the great forests where the old ways of survival are still honored. He stayed for 3 months. Witnesses said his medicines worked when nothing else did. His advice on food preservation kept the miners from starving. His calm leadership held the community together when hope had all but frozen. But when the mining company's spring supply wagons finally reached the site, Hawthorne was gone along with 12 miners who were never seen again. Decades later, researchers poring over forgotten mining records made unsettling discoveries. The camp survivors displayed behavior eerily similar to what had been documented in Millbrook. They hoarded food compulsively. Some refused to cook meat at all. The usual social structure of the camp had shifted, reorganized around strange hierarchies and rites that no one could explain. They talked in hushed tones of a teacher who had shown them how to survive, how to truly survive. Dr. Ezekiel Putnam, the man who had once stood alone against Hawthorne's cult in Millbrook, died of pneumonia in 1863. His final journal entry, written weeks before his death, has haunted investigators, historians, and behavioral psychologists for over a century. In it, he warned, the man we knew as Samuel Hawthorne understood something about human nature that civilized people prefer not to acknowledge. That under the right conditions, using the right words, and with enough time, anyone can be convinced that the unthinkable is not only acceptable, but necessary. He didn't create monsters. He gave them permission to become what they already were. Putnam's words proved eerily prophetic. Just over a decade after the Millbrook incident, America erupted into the Civil War. Across battlefields and burning towns, ordinary men committed atrocities that would have seemed impossible only years before. The fragile shell of civilization cracked just as it had in Millbrook, and beneath it, instincts. Hunger, fear, tribal loyalty, obedience, survival. Today, modern psychologists recognize the strategies Hawthorne used all too well. Gradual exposure to extreme ideas, isolation from dissent, creating dependencies through healing and emotional rescue, conditioning through repeated small betrayals of one's ethics until nothing feels forbidden. His methods match the blueprints of cult indoctrination, military conditioning, and trauma-based manipulation. But what makes Hawthorne's story truly terrifying is not the cannibalism. It's how easy it was to get there. How little resistance he faced. How much people wanted to believe in him. This isn't just a horror story from the 1800s. It's a warning. A reminder that the line between healer and destroyer, teacher and predator can dissolve when the only value left is survival. Samuel Hawthorne didn't just break a town. He proved how breakable we are. So what do you think? Was everything revealed, or is there still more to uncover about Samuel Hawthorne's identity and the organization he seemed to serve? Could his network of survival communities still exist today, hidden in the coldest corners of the American wilderness? Leave your theories in the comments. What was Hawthorne's true mission? Was he rogue, or part of something much, much larger? If this tale from America's hidden history gave you chills, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this story with someone who loves historical mysteries that make you question everything. And join us next time as we uncover another chapter authorities tried to bury deep in the snow, far from civilization, and even further from what we think we know about ourselves. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.